Okay, welcome everybody to the presentation on LAAC's adoption of a 32-hour work week. I'm Selena Copeland, the Executive Director of LAAC. I use she, her pronouns, and other LAAC staff will introduce themselves in just a second. But if you are able to hear me, then you probably won't need closed captions, but there are closed captions on the bottom. And we will be using, I think you can use Q&A if you need to ask any questions throughout, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. So I'll let our other team members introduce themselves.
I'm Zach Newman. I use he, him pronouns, and I am the directing attorney at LAAC. Yoselin.
Hi everyone, I'm Yoselin. I am the training and outreach coordinator at LAAC, and I use she, her pronouns.
Okay, now we're going to get into the presentation portion. We do have a slide deck. There's a lot of information on the slide deck. So we're providing it, either we just sent it to you or we'll send it to you right after the presentation. If you're watching this after the event and you don't have the slide deck, let us know. There's just so much information on there about LAAC's process in particular, but we have, as you know, a full report that we've published, and all of our tools that we use, we're making available to anyone who wants to use them. So we'll open up the slide. Okay, so here's just a brief agenda. I'll do some table setting, what to expect. Zach will talk about the experiment design process and the survey findings, and Yoselin will talk about employee experience, and then we'll get to Q&A. Okay. So I've decided to call this a buffet. So what we're talking about today is specifically what LAAC did, but we'll also talk about other things that you can do if you are considering a 4-day work week, or if your organization is already at a 35-hour work week. There may be things that you like that you want to take today, but you can come back later for more. And you also, of course, can reject what doesn't look good right now. And on the next slide, I just acknowledge that we know what may be affecting your appetite right now for this discussion. There's kind of like, I guess, positive and negatives here. It's really hard to talk about a 4-day work week or a 32-hour work week, or even talking about reduced work weeks when there's a growing and constant need for legal services. The pressure right now to do more, it feels really, it feels like a lot. Almost crushing to do more. There's also, for many organizations, a time of scarce resources and funding cuts. Our community has been really impacted by federal funding cuts or threats of federal funding cuts, loss of state resources. So some of that may feel really hard to change your workload when you're already looking at potentially restructuring some of your staff. There's also perceptions or concern about perception by funders or others that we should be doing more or working harder. And even if there isn't that perception, sometimes we worry that there is that perception. We have to prove ourselves to be doing more, working harder. Acknowledging the LAAC board is not like every other board, so there may be board challenges in adopting a reduced work week, whether that could be moving from a 40-hour work week to 35 or 37.25 to 32. There may be some board challenges right now in looking at alternative models. You may have rigid grant and contract deliverables. We did not have that issue at LAAC, but some of you may be locked into government contracts or government grants that require a certain number of hours and a certain amount of pay that may make it harder, or you may need more lead up time to consider a 4-day work week or a 32-hour work week. A lot of organizations really want to be available, always available to clients in crisis. And so it's hard to consider what it might look like if you reduce your work hours. How does that impact your clients' availability for your clients? So those are things that may make it harder to embrace a 4-day work week or a 32-hour work week now. But other things to consider are there's a lot of burnout in long-term staff. For many of us who've been doing this work for 15, 20 years or more, it's really hard to keep doing it at the pace that we had to do, in recent years. There's also a need to be really creative to keep staff given the low salaries. So that's kind of the trade-off with the scarce resources and funding cuts. If you're unable to increase salaries at the rate that you want to, there are other things you can do to be creative, including reducing the work week. I think this is an excellent time to have some recruitment opportunities for younger and newer attorneys to really think about how can we be a really inviting workplace that invites people to have a strong commitment to mission, but also time to spend time, availability to spend time with their family or friends or their communities. And that really addresses the generational expectations of balance and wellness. For those of you who may be Gen Xers like me, we've heard for a very long time about how we are burning everyone out and how we perhaps are not being good models ourselves. So this is a really a great opportunity to think through, the next generation of leaders who are coming up behind us and already mixing in with us. How can we create workplaces that are attractive and are good homes for everyone? So on the next slide, here is this your off ramp. If you are very, very interested in a 32-hour work week or a 4-day work week, but you're already saying we don't have the appetite now, we don't have a board that will approve it now. These are some other ideas. And for most of these ideas, LAAC incorporated those before we shifted to a 32-hour work week. So you could incorporate, for example, job sharing. This is more common in government offices, but it's literally 2 people doing one job. So I guess the budget impact of this is you're doing benefits for both, but you're actually having 2 people share one job, and it's more sustainable for people, especially people returning from medical leave or family leave who may need more time to kind of get back up to speed. You could design positions to be held by 2 people. You can look at flexible working hours, and I've been saying not just working extra on weekends. Don't say flexible working hours, which means you can also work on Saturdays. Really think about what your needs are of your staff. Some people may say that I really need to be off by 3 o'clock every day. My kid's school doesn't have a bus system. I have to go pick them up from school every day. And being able to end my day at 3 p.m. means I don't have to pay for aftercare. So really think about your flexible working hours and what that would mean to your staff and their ability to stay and not to burn out. We incorporate staff morale surveys every year, or now it's every year, but you can even do it every other year, looking at staff connection to mission, what's causing stress, looking at workload analysis. So there are probably lots of tools out there, but even just informal conversations with teams to say, how is your workload? How are things looking? Looking at timesheets really particularly to say, do we have exempt staff who are already working over 40 hours? Do we have staff who are never taking vacations? What's preventing them from taking vacations? For a lot of organizations, it may seem an easier fix to reduce the work week, but sometimes a first step is, how do you make it possible that someone can step away from work, whether that's for 2 days, a week, or 2 weeks? How do you promote that vacation culture? And if this is a topic that you're interested in, I love talking about what we've done at LAAC over the last 5 to 10 years to make it easier to take vacations. Another thing you can do, which we did before we did the 32-hour work week, is reducing the eligibility for healthcare benefits. So previously, you had to work at LAAC for at least 30 hours a week to get healthcare benefits. Maybe even for a while, we may have been at 35, but we intentionally reduced healthcare benefits to 20 hours a week so that people who are returning from medical leave and needed to come back part-time and slowly increase their hours, they would always maintain their healthcare benefits. So that's something you could look into, and that's something you may need to have time to change. If your healthcare and other benefits are set at a 35-hour or a 40-hour work week, you may need to untangle that and have it a lower hour threshold. More shared leadership in teams. So a lot of people who've been on teams or team leaders for a long time, they're shouldering a lot of work, they're shouldering a lot of institutional knowledge. How do we incorporate younger and newer staff who have those leadership skills, but we are not giving them the opportunity to run their own programs? So it's another thing that's really important that we do a lot at LAAC intentionally through things like shared tools. And the last one is like, it's a little bit trickier to articulate. So organizations should figure out how to allow a voluntary reduced workload for reduced pay if you're not ready to incorporate a 32-hour or 4-day work week. We had several staff at LAAC who already were working, we were a 35-hour work week, but several staff were already voluntarily working a 32-hour work week for reduced pay, specifically because they wanted to be able to have more time off. So we created a structure where it was people were able to do that. And we already had things in place like shared calendars and shared planning tools so that those staff who were not working the full 35 hours were still able to stay in touch with everything that might have happened on the one day they were out each week. And I think I have one more slide that's a little bit more. Oh, wait, add one more. Where's that one? Did it get moved around? Hold on, let's see if I can find it. Give me 1 second because it's the one that says ED stuff.
Selena, I believe it's 2 after this.
Great, got it. Okay, then um, I was used to my color green. Okay, so these are the questions from register. Okay, you can come back, Jocelyn. It's fine. I can go in the order that was planned. The audience. Okay, so for those of you who are here, what we heard from you, we asked you in registration what you were already doing, and most organizations, the average was 37 hours a week. About 21% of you have a 40-hour work week, but most organizations are around 35, 37.5. Only one organization was at 32 hours. Is your organization considering testing? Most said no, but some said possibly or starting to research. And then 2 organizations are currently piloting the 32-hour work week, and 1 has already adopted it. So that's a little bit about who's in the room. So we know that a lot of you are still working 37.5 or 40 hours a week. And then the next slide is some of the themes we saw in the questions, which we will address almost all of these in the actual presentation. But if any of them are not addressed throughout the presentation, we'll answer it in the Q&A at the end. Folks are asking, how do you convince a board that's different from LAAC's board? Our board is made up 100% of legal nonprofit staff. How do we consider these changes right now with the economic and political climate? And that was the piece I raised earlier about, the perceived need to work harder and do more. How did the reduced work week impact compensation? I'll tell you now, it did not impact compensation. So that was a really important piece. There was no loss of pay. We will not address, but we can have some Q&A and some follow-up around like case carrying attorneys and advocates, like how you deal with attorneys who may have to go to court. Many of you have attended other little like panels and working sessions where you talk about how you figure out the court dates. And for almost everyone I've talked to, if you have a court date, you just go to a court, you go to your hearing, even if it's your normal day off, you just figure out internally how to switch that. And so for most organizations, I've heard that closing on Friday seems to work better because there tend to be less hearings on Friday. But if you have a hearing on Friday, you go to work on Friday. That kind of is part of your ethical duty as a lawyer. Issues that arose with meal breaks, overtime, and holidays. I think Zach will go over a little bit of this, but if there's still kind of questions, we'll do it at the end. And then other flexible options for organizations who may not reduce their hourly work week. And yes, that was a little bit about what I talked about at the beginning, but if there's more questions later on, there are other flexible options. And I really hope that organizations who, even if it's a budget reason why you can't switch to 4-day work week or 32-hour work week now, that you really think about the other flexible options. And then I think now is the slide about, here we go. Yes. So these are like the first steps in the values. And this is why we called it from skeptic to champion, because for many years, I was concerned about switching to a 32-hour work week. For LAAC, we do not have clients, so we don't have the concern about court dates, but we are very available to our community. For those of you who email me, I usually tend to email you back within the day with what you're looking for. And it was really important to me of thinking through like, how will this impact our availability to our community? And so I was reluctant to test a 4-day work week or 32-hour work week for a few years because I thought it was too hard to figure out how to do it that way. So, but the values that I centered when I thought, okay, we can try this. Compensation must remain the same. So for all full-time staff, whether they're hourly or exempt, they should not lose pay. And so that was a core value for us. And interestingly, people who were already at a 32-hour work week voluntarily for reduced pay, what it meant for them is that they actually received an increase in compensation when 32 hours became the full-time work week. So compensation remained the same, but it actually, no deduction, but there was an increase. I needed to step back from the nitty gritty. So I really needed someone who understood our payroll system, our benefits, and HR laws. I did not want to be in the weeds of that because I knew that those would be walls that would be very hard for me to overcome. And I needed a programmatic staffer who was committed to the success of the program, but would also not someone who would sugarcoat it and would be really honest with me about the impact of programs and would think through how to evaluate that. So based on what were my personal needs in order for the organization to take this jump, I created a very small working group. Our senior operations person and a senior attorney, so that would be our senior operations manager and our directing attorney. They were the working group who started looking at the design. I did not want to call it a pilot. I know a lot of organizations call it a pilot. I was worried about calling it a pilot because what if it failed? And calling it a pilot usually means you're going to pilot, you're going to do it. And so from the very beginning, I called it an experiment, and I said, it might not work, but we're going to experiment. And to me, just the word experiment allowed me to really think through, okay, what can we test? What can we look at? This is a little bit of a laboratory. We can try something out. And if it doesn't work, we let it go. And the experiment had to work for all staff. I really did not want the work to shift from hourly staff to exempt staff. I really wanted to watch those hours and make sure that the exempt staff were not, consistently working more than 32 or 35 hours every week, to protect the hourly staff who are keeping it 32. So that was really an important part of the design for me. And then what took a little bit longer to realize is that the 4-day work week is not my current need. And so that's why I often said a 32-hour work week. Even if I said 32-hour, 4-day, most of our staff chose a 4-day work week, but I do not want, and I do not need a 4-day work week. For me, I really need sometimes those shorter days. I need the flexibility. I have to pick up sometimes a kid from school. I always work 5 days a week. I just wanted those times when I was able to make it a little bit shorter. And so recognizing that everything is slightly different for every staff member, I think that is really important for my first step. And I think that's the end of my slides, and I'm sure I went way over on time. So we'll get on to the all of the program design.
That was perfect. Thank you, Selena. So I'm up next. Thank you, Selena, for that great introduction. I'm Zach Newman. I'm the directing attorney at LAAC. I'm going to be running through a summary of the experiment design process, as well as a review of some of our findings. Hopefully some of you at least have gotten to check out the full 32-hour workweek report that we produced earlier this spring and actually re-released recently. But I'm excited to be here to go through some of the high-level data, findings, takeaways, and then answer any questions that you might have. So on this slide, you can see a little bit more about the process that Selena spoke to. So after abundant planning or what I'll call abundant planning in mid-2024, we officially launched the 32-hour workweek experiment for 3 months from August to October, which is a relatively short time frame. So we had to kind of hit the ground running in some ways. And so before this, a lot had to happen in terms of kind of developing and planning an effective experiment. In designing the experiment, I think the question we sought to answer was, is this something that could work at LAAC? With work, meaning, would it benefit employees while not diminishing our services to our members, which is, after all, the most important thing? Our hypothesis, I think, was yes, and that was part of the motivation to conduct the experiment. But we ultimately wanted kind of a more empirical way to answer this question rather than just mostly anecdotal. And so I think that's kind of the main motivation for why we engaged in the experiment. Selena just spoke about this, but Selena kicked the project off in terms of working closely with the board, tapping myself as the directing attorney and our senior operations manager, Hannah Davidman, to form this 2-person working group that was tasked with designing and implementing this experiment over this short time frame. And so during that time frame, we met regularly, Hannah and I, and then we met often with Selena as well, and developed what we considered to be a process that brought staff in to get buy-in and make sure they could voice their thoughts, which entailed multiple comprehensive opportunities for input, feedback, to ensure what we strove for, which was a participatory process, and ultimately, through that, a feasible experiment. And so, as you can see here, there were multiple elements to this, but during this time period, we developed interim and draft policies, survey tools, and then once we thought this infrastructure was in place, we launched the experiment. And then until recently, we've been in this kind of post-experiment phase of reviewing the survey data and developing the report. And then, as Selena described, the board approved it permanently earlier this spring. Okay, I think the next slide should be some findings. Okay, great. What did the experiment reveal for us? So our findings were based on our 2 sets of survey tools that staff engaged with, what we called our perception survey and what we called our main impact survey. And so based on these two staff surveys, our results indicated that the experiment was successful for LAAC, providing an objective basis to support the idea that we should implement it long term. And then what exactly did success mean for us? This was something we discussed extensively in teams as all staff in staff meetings, and of course during what we called listening sessions throughout the planning period. But to us, data demonstrated that A, there wasn't a significant disruption to our services for members, like I said, while B, staff also increased efficiency and effectiveness, and C, we could also mitigate burnout, improve schedules, get more time for outside of work activities, and many more benefits. Next slide, please. Okay, great. So in this way, we considered it successful in a few ways, but namely because the benefits outweighed the challenges for us, for LAAC, which were ultimately relatively minimal and actually primarily revolved around internal scheduling. And based on this, our conclusion was that this was a sustainable, positive policy change for an organization like ours and should be implemented on a permanent basis. I think next slide. Thank you. Okay, so in terms of the first survey tool, what we called our perception survey, and I'll be pretty brief with this because there's just a ton of data, as you could tell from the report that we collected. So I'll be fairly high level, but in terms of the perception survey, we designed this as kind of the before and after survey tool. So it was administered twice over the course of, the pre-experiment, post-experiment time periods. And the goal of this survey by itself was to capture how people perceived or understood or kind of viewed the 32-hour work week from a conceptual standpoint and how this may have changed after the experiment. So this wasn't really like a fully necessary survey to conduct. I think the purpose of it was really to capture this perception or view. Like, what were people thinking about beforehand? What did they think about it after in kind of a more conceptual sense? And so, as you can see here, the main finding was kind of that people were generally excited, of course, before the experiment to engage in it. And then what we saw was that what they were most excited about kind of came to fruition in the sense that there's a chart in the report that you can check out where it just shows like it either maintained or it surpassed expectations in many ways. And then kind of the corollary was that what they were afraid of or worried about or like the negatives, those things mostly decreased. So kind of just trying to measure, what were you thinking about before? Did that actually happen in terms of both positives and negatives? So for example, the benefits people envisioned and actually saw in the experiment included things like increased efficiency, better schedules, and then challenges, of course, were things like the challenges being things people were worried about, or workloads being negatively impacted, decreased quality of work, things like that. So the point is that staff expectations tended to be right about what they saw as positive before they started the experiment, and then they actually experienced less of what they were worried about happening or would be challenged by. Okay, next slide, I have a few particular highlights. So to kind of better paint this picture, we can see here that, for example, 100% saw improved time management. So that indicates increased efficiency and effectiveness and probably, contributed to other interrelated data like ability to get work done, things like that. So what that means is after, like comparing before and after, everybody saw that they could improve their time management. If they were worried about it before, maybe they became less worried. Ultimately, everybody across the board saw they could improve their time management. 0% ultimately perceived their workload negatively impacted through their reduced hours. And then the last one I flagged was there are also decreases in things like fear around worsened external communication. That was a really important one for us, was ensuring that we could still communicate with our members, stakeholders, the bar, everyone we talk to, on a daily basis, which suggested to us that our external as well as internal communication were impacted to a lesser degree than folks were kind of worried about pre-experiment versus post. So that kind of just indicated that conceptually it was generally a success. Okay, next slide, please. This is kind of the key survey for us. This was like this is what we called the main impact survey. And this one we did 4 times total, I think, once before to kind of set the baseline, 2 months during, looking back to the prior month, and then 1 in November afterwards. And as you'll see, there's tons of charts in the report kind of documenting those time frames. And so, of course, as I mentioned, this survey was different and the main one in the sense that it included like the actual impacts in terms of measuring our work in terms of things like deliverables, workloads, job descriptions, job satisfaction, productivity, all those kinds of things. That's how we gathered data from staff, from their how it impacted them in terms of their work and their life outside of work. Okay, and so overall, as I've described, what we found was a positive impact on work and personal lives from the experiment based on all this stuff that we tried to measure. And just some highlights were, you know, more time to engage in activities outside of work, more time to take care of family, things like that. And then doing that all while increasing or maintaining our efficiency, effectiveness, and our engagement with our mission and our ability to serve our members. Next slide. Okay, this is a lot of text, but this is basically the universe of all the stuff we tracked that we wanted to capture in our main impact survey. There's likely other things we could have done. Maybe it was too much. Either way, it was good to just kind of settle on one universe of elements that we thought would produce the most useful data set to then bring that to our board, which was, of course, the main goal. Next slide. Okay, so I only have 4 of these slides. It's basically the different categories that were on the prior slide. So the first one is what we called work-life balance as a category of questions and queries for staff. And so as you can see from this survey and the data set, there's obviously a lot of content here, but it's all in the report. There were a lot of positive things that happened in terms of work-life balance specifically, as you know, would be predicted and we would hope for, of course, designing this kind of project. So things like job satisfaction went up or stayed similar, work-life balance, ability to care for, to take care of, or do things outside of work improved. Schedule flexibility, a big one. Capacity to go on vacations or use sick time. These were all generally maintained or improved during the experiment, which to us indicated at the very least a positive impact on employees' work-life balance. Next slide, please. Okay. Individual productivity is something we discussed extensively as a team and as staff in terms of what does productivity mean to us? How do we measure that? How does it relate to job descriptions and evaluations and all of our pre-existing systems for quote unquote measuring productivity? So as you can see here, individual productivity and effectiveness, is a really critical element of this. We wanted to provide the same or improved services, and implicitly that's basically through, greater efficiency combined with, greater job satisfaction, people coming to work refreshed, things like that. And so this all played out according to the data for us. Workers were able to get their jobs done, do them well within the timeframes required by grants, deliverables, et cetera, everything we're kind of, constrained by or have to operate within. So from deliverables to outcomes and outputs, we didn't really see a diminishing return on, the fewer hours that people were working. And there were some interesting things that I thought that we measured, like greater focus, creativity, increasing in multiple ways. I thought that was an interesting data point too. One interesting thing has been kind of investigating stress, because stress is obviously contingent on many factors. And so like during this time period, I think it's challenging to try to be like, okay, does a reduced work week equal less stress? And the key thing we did find was greater control over one's schedule was a factor in decreasing stress. But we had a short time frame, and so it's challenging to kind of develop an empirical sense, in the sense that we had staff out for extended periods of time. There was, of course, the election. We had our largest in-person conference in years. So, we're also a 10-person team. So those are just some of my caveats around the study itself. But just to emphasize that point again, we did see that one's schedule or ability to control one's schedule was definitely a factor in decreasing stress, even if stress levels purely on their own kind of stayed similar, as you can see in the report. Lastly, on this slide, I think strikingly, 100% of LAAC staff strongly agreed most months of the experiment that their ability to control their schedule keeps them at LAAC. And of course, LAAC has always offered pretty generous autonomy around schedules, but this definitely heightened that positive aspect of retention, at least for our staff. Okay, last couple slides. Team success. I'll go through this one pretty quickly. Teams were successful. We asked staff to evaluate how they were doing with their team, things like workloads, communication, effectiveness as a team. We saw really good results in this way. Of course, it took a little bit of time at the beginning to get things together and schedules and all that kind of stuff. And one key thing that Selena was discussing was, we're obviously open every day. So we kind of settled on this idea that each team was able to, obviously communicate with other teams. So within each team, staff members would work together to decide, what day they're doing. So for example, I, on the advocacy team, would swap out with my colleague, Brianne, for Mondays versus Fridays some weeks. And in that sense, it was also flexible because I don't necessarily work a 4-day work week every week. Some weeks I do when it works for the team, works for the organization and myself. But generally, there's a fair amount of flexibility. And I think that we saw that in the team success data, that folks were able to, once the scheduling stuff was worked out, manage their workloads, get everything done that they wanted to in the right timeframes. Okay, next slide. This category is the last category, and it's the one where we're kind of trying to manage, it's like you can kind of see each level of thinking with the categories: work-life balance overall, individual productivity, team success, and now organizational success. We wanted to understand how people were feeling, as a member of LAAC, not a member, as an employee of LAAC, in terms of camaraderie, mission performance. Are we still serving our members in the way that we want to? Responsiveness, availability for members. And what we saw was a positive impact on this as well. Staff did not feel that these aspects declined or declined significantly, that we were able to keep doing all the things that we want to, even within this smaller time frame. And again, just to reiterate the point, of course, efficiency is a factor in that, of people coming back, feeling like they had their day off or whatever, a more flexible schedule on the Thursday, coming back Friday, whatever it is, to be able to, come back and engage in their job productively that day. And so, yeah, I think that's kind of the main things I want to say about organizational success. And I think the key for us was being able to stay open, stay responsive, and be here for our members throughout this process. Okay, my last slide. I was just going to end up on some quotes. I think that we tried to, in the study, balance collecting a lot of quantitative information, but also staff were great in terms of taking the time to fill the surveys out thoughtfully and give us a lot more qualitative data as well. And so, yeah, as you can see, just to kind of close out my portion as the report person, the main impacts really show the experiment actually impacted folks in a really positive way. And I think they're able to do their jobs, and it was to us a success in terms of balancing efficiency, effectiveness, capacity, time management, all the good things that we all think about, no matter the hours that we work. I think that we were able to fulfill our mission, hopefully, and do the work that we do. And now for our final act, I'm going to pass it off so that you can hear a little bit more about kind of the direct staff experience on the ground, so to speak. Thank you.
Thanks, Zach. So I'm Yoselin. Like I mentioned in the beginning, I am the training and outreach coordinator at LAAC, and I started about 6 months I started working here about 6 months before we started the 32-hour work week experiment. And I'm a part of the Law Help California and trainings team. So today I'll be talking about my experience throughout this process as an employee, and I'll start off with the Law Help team. So before we started the experiment, we did have several conversations within the Law Help team to discuss days off, and we wanted to create a backup plan in case a team member was unexpectedly out. This ended up being really helpful in this team because we supervise students who volunteer for our live chat program. So we had to discuss what to do in the event that one of us had to be out and couldn't supervise a shift. When the experiment first began, one of our team members had to stop working for several weeks suddenly due to a personal reason, and they also took their sabbatical during this time. But thanks to that backup plan that we created before, we were able to adjust and to keep our team running smoothly. Moving on to the trainings team. The trainings team is a lot smaller, so it was easier to adjust to the shorter work week. We did run into a scheduling problem when we first started the experiment. Initially, the days we could take off were Wednesdays and Fridays, but our busiest days tend to be Wednesdays since those are the days we usually host trainings. And after expressing this issue, Monday was added as an option for a day off. So then both me and my supervisor were able to take separate days off without it interfering with our webinars. We also just continued to meet weekly as a team, and we coordinated who would revise the trainings email for any urgent matters when the other person was out. And I think just setting up a procedure for our team helped us stay on top of our external communication and to set us up for an easier transition. So to be honest, it was hard to think of some challenges because there weren't many after we switched to a 32-hour work week, at least from an employee's perspective. I think in the beginning of the experiment, the biggest challenge was finding time for new meetings, but this did become easier as time went on. We got used to everyone's schedule, and I believe that the shorter work week actually made us more efficient with our time. This experiment improved my work-life balance tremendously, and I think most of the LAC team would agree. Personally, this experiment gave me more time to dedicate towards my law school applications and to just spend time with friends and family. I was already used to working the 35 hours, and I didn't think that the extra 3 hours a week would make a huge difference, but honestly, having that extra day in my week to take care of personal things or just enjoy life has really helped me. I think implementing a 32-hour work week was a great experience for myself and for LAC. I think even a small change in hours can make a big difference in people's lives, and I strongly recommend members of our community to explore this model. And with that, I'll hand it back to Selena and Zach.
And I wanted to share one of my, I guess, employee perspectives. And I'm answering questions in the, I guess, in the Q&A feature. If anyone has follow-up questions, feel free to ask them there. And I guess I think everybody can see the Q&A, but if you can't, tell me in the Q&A and I can read aloud the questions and answers. But my experience as an employee is literally on the first day of our experiment, I signed up for pottery lessons. I felt that, being able to have a new hobby would be a good reason to not be in the office, every single day from 9 to 5. And we started this experiment back in August of 2024, and I'm still doing pottery now. So it's a real tangible thing that I started taking classes and have developed a new hobby and a new community. And other staff are able to take lessons or classes. And so those are the kinds of things that if you think there's not much of a difference between 35 and 32, there is, because it gives you the space to say, I'm actually going to be out every Monday morning. And so those are the kinds of things that I do think it's worth it to experiment and see if there's a value to organizations that have a lot of staff who say they don't have time for anything besides work. So are people able to see the Q&A? I'm never really sure. I hope everybody's able to see them. So if you are not, or if you're watching this later and you want to know what the Q&A is, one person asked if you reduced your PTO, if we reduced our PTO, since employees are taking more time off. And I said, During the experiment period, we did not reduce PTO, or as Zach said earlier, we used gap pay, and that's what people were paid for 3 hours for not working. But post-experiment, we reduced our vacation and sick time to match what people were accruing who were already at 32 hours. So essentially what that means is if you were accruing 3 weeks of vacation at 35 hours, when you shifted to 32 hours, you accrued 3 weeks of vacation of 32 hours. So that was the same. It was reduced hours wise, but it was the same, effectively the same. And we did not remove any, and someone had a question about holidays. We did not take away any, federal or state holidays that we had previously observed. We also maintained our year-end office closure. And the shift there was that our holidays pre-experiment were 7-hour days. And post-experiment, they're 8-hour days. So the holidays are longer days. We did reduce the floating holidays. We had previously, for a few years, had floating holidays, largely because people were not taking vacation. And so we implemented floating holidays that were use it or lose it. But with the increase in holiday hours from 7 hours to 8 hours, we removed those floating holidays, but there still was a net gain in holiday hours for staff. And then, so someone asked about the reduction. It was a pro rata deduction from 35 to 32s. It was effectively the same. Someone asked if we had comp time for exempt staff. No, we don't have comp time. Some organizations do. I think especially if you're unionized, you may have comp time. We've never had comp time for our exempt staff. We hope that workloads allow you to work in the past, 35 hours or 32. And if there are individuals who are working a whole lot more than that, then we have conversations around workload. But we do not have a formal comp time policy. Okay, are there other questions? We're happy to answer. If there are any questions in the registration that you feel we didn't answer, feel free to put them there. So who's going to do a 42-hour work week now? I think Zach may have mentioned this in the presentation, but I really wanted to reiterate, it was important to me to say a 32-hour work week. We have some staff who are parents who have caregiving responsibilities, and really working 8-hour days every day, it could be a challenge. And so I really wanted to make it clear that we welcome 32 hours. That could be 4 regular days and a very short Friday, or it could be 4 longer Monday to Thursday days with no Friday, but we really wanted to be flexible. So it wasn't baked in that there was always a day off every single time, because we have so many meetings on Fridays. A lot of us who do advocacy work, there are a lot of meetings on Friday. And so we would be constantly shifting schedules if we didn't build in that flexibility to begin with.
And I think one thing to add on that, like, we've developed a system where it is fairly predictable at this point. Like, people have a lot of autonomy or flexibility, but I feel like our communication is so good, and our use of calendars and things like that has been effective enough that, like, we can figure it out team by team, just to make sure that, if somebody's going to be online each day or something like that. But I did want to emphasize that some staff are really diligent in using their 4-day work week, in the sense of doing, 4 8-hour days and working 32 hours that week. But I think Selena's, absolutely right that our experiment was a 32-hour work week and not per se a 4-day work week. And like I said, like, for me, maybe I'll do 2 weeks out of the month that are 4-day weeks, and then maybe the other weeks are like, mix and match in terms of working every day.
I think like that also, being flexible and kind of supporting a culture of flexibility, I guess like supporting a culture of flexibility was important to me, because if somebody is running a program and they have obligations on Friday, I didn't want them to say like, oh, Friday's my day off, I'm not doing it. I really wanted people to say, okay, for this to work, this means that occasionally, even though I like to not work Fridays, I'm going to attend this meeting on Friday. People don't have to attend, they don't have to work the full 8 hours on Friday. They could work work just that 1-hour meeting on Friday. But I wanted people to still maintain their, I really wanted people to still maintain their like ownership over their projects, and not feel that we were hot potatoing. So people would just cover a meeting if they happen to be working that day. That's part of like my hope, that everybody feels that they have ownership of their own projects, is that they I guess what's the right word? It's like they take care of it themselves. If like, usually I don't work on a Friday, but there's a meeting on Friday, I'm going to go to it. I had some questions here I wanted to answer live. One person said, can you talk about grants not being okay with this, and specifically LSC, OVW, and State Bar? I do know that there are LSC funded programs that are piloting this. So if you work at an LSC funded program, you may want to reach out to another organization. I think some organizations now are just being, they're being very careful about talking with funders in advance. But several IALTA funded organizations are doing this, and the State Bar has, I guess, given their sign of approval. So I haven't heard about it being a problem with those grants in particular, but I do think it will be a challenge if you have any government contracts or grants that require specific numbers of hours. You may need to look back at how you're billing your time and making sure that it's not going to create challenges. You may need to have, like, for example, some unrestricted funding to kind of fill in the gaps if you're not billing down the grants and contracts as you originally envisioned when you applied for that funding 3 years ago. Someone also asked if our email signatures list our schedules. No. Some of us have in our email signatures that we may work atypical hours. Some of us may choose to say, I don't work Fridays, but the goal is that you wouldn't notice that we weren't working a particular day. And so if somebody were going on vacation, they would include that in their email signature. It'd be an away message. I did encourage people who had several days out of office kind of back to back, whether it was kind of like going to conferences or whatever. I did encourage them to set away messages, but our goal really, you wouldn't know that we were working 32 hours because you would not notice the delay in replies. Someone said, did you reach out to funders and let them know that you were piloting the shortened work week? Did you reach out to them after you made it permanent? No, but that's the thing that LAAC is really, we are a weird unicorn because we have very few funders that require specific hours. Most of our grants are general operating, and most of our contracts are billed as FTEs. And so we did not. I know other organizations reached out to funders in advance, but for us, it didn't impact the way that we build our work. And there was one that was a little bit of a wrinkle, and we just we made it work.
And just to add on to that, I think part of what we tried to capture in the surveys was this sense of, were people able to, still meet their deliverables, do all the things that we need to for our grants? And so we did seek to measure that, of course, but as Selena said, it wasn't like a precondition for us doing it. It was just, could we still meet all the demands that we need to that were already in existence? But it wasn't predicated on that.
Okay, if there are other questions, we're happy to answer more questions. I'm answering a few private questions here.
And I'll just say we're all available to chat more after this if questions come up.
The last thing I'll say, because I can't shut up, is that with the most recent election, a lot of folks were talking about how they were concerned about burning out. A lot of executive directors that I'm friends with, that I consider longtime friends, have expressed their worry that their more senior staff would burn out. That it feels very hard to do this work and to maintain the level of work that we did when we were younger. I kept joking, I'm 8 years older than I was the last time around. And so if burnout is a main concern and your staff is expressing that, I really do encourage you to figure out if you can experiment or pilot, or even say, we're doing this for 1 quarter. It is a time limited thing. If you're considering adopting it permanently, I do really think you should do the full survey, the ZAC methodology of all the surveys and the tools and figuring out client impact. But if you just need like a bit of a breathing room, even having something short-term can help people kind of catch their breath. So I encourage everyone to consider, to think about it. And if you can't do it, then think about those other things about flexibility.
And I will just add one thing to that is, of course, our surveys were all, staff directed. And if you're a direct service organization, you're going to have to measure the client impact, the impacts on the communities that you're serving. But we have, a few examples at least of orgs who have successfully done this, and I'm sure they'd be, willing to share more in-depth resources about how they were able to conduct their surveys to, provide compelling results that, one, it, was beneficial, or, staff were able to get through it, and also that, clients weren't, negatively impacted by it.
Yeah, I think the goal for everyone is that there's if you adopt it, that there's a seamless integration, that clients don't realize, there's so much information about, how effective or efficient you can be if you're, not burnt out. And so our deal was that we would do this, you wouldn't notice, that staff would be happier, that we would be able to do the same work and maybe even with more energy and with joy, because we weren't facing quite as many hours of fighting in the week. And I think that's it. I don't see any other questions. Oh, one more. Okay, one more question. Oh, someone asked, has any org been able to get feedback from clients as they've tested this? I haven't seen any of that yet, but Zach may be aware of it.
I think there are some publicly available reports, but if anyone on the call, is engaged in a pilot, or, is the one org who has it permanently, I think I know which one that is, of course. But if anyone wants to share any resources with me, that I could share out after this, that'd be helpful. But yeah.
Yeah, you also could, if you aren't sure about formal surveying tools, you could also do client feedback sessions. You could do a client listening session. You could do ways of engaging your community to find out, what do they expect in terms of office hours open. I do know a lot of organizations just close on Friday, and that may not work for certain communities. But it did seem pretty common that there would be a way that you would, basically be closed for intake, but would do court hearings on Friday. Okay, I think there's no more questions. Thank you everyone for your time. And I'm happy to be able to present this with my colleagues on Law Day. So if you're watching this in the future, today is Law Day, and I got to see many of you in person at rallies. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.